It was the summer of 1993 in a small divided village near the outskirts of Ramallah, Palestine. Leah Cohen, a 35-year-old Jewish woman, lived with her husband and their teenage son in a modest stone house at the edge of the village. From the outside, her life seemed typical. Her husband, David, worked long hours at the local market, providing for the family, while Leah devoted her days to household chores and taking care of their son, Isaac. But appearances can be deceiving. For months, Leah had felt a growing void in her life. David, distracted by work and the turmoil in the region, had become distant. The warmth between them had long faded, leaving Leah feeling isolated and forgotten. Her days, once filled with love and companionship, had become an endless loop of monotony, each day blending into the next. And in a place where neighbors kept their distance due to political and cultural divides, Leah felt more alone than ever. But there was one man who noticed her, someone she should never have allowed herself to get close to. His name was Youssef al-Faraj, a Palestinian farmer who lived just down the road. The two had exchanged polite greetings over the years, but it was only recently that their conversations had deepened, blossoming into something far more dangerous. Youssef was everything David wasn't: kind, attentive, and genuinely interested in Leah's thoughts. At first, their encounters were innocent, brief exchanges by the well or in passing on the road, but soon they began to meet in secret, under the cover of night. Leah had always told herself that she would never cross that line, but the longing for affection, for someone to see her, was too powerful to resist. As the days turned into weeks, the guilt gnawed at Leah. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She knew the risks, the consequences if anyone found out. But the connection she shared with Youssef felt like an escape from the stifling reality of her life. And as the two of them grew closer, so did the danger surrounding them. The village was a powder keg, where relationships like theirs were not just frowned upon, they were seen as betrayals of the highest order. But Leah's heart had become deaf to reason. The more time she spent with Youssef, the deeper she fell into the forbidden affair, unable to pull herself away, even as the world around them grew darker. One fateful night, Leah stood in the doorway of her house, her hands trembling. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the village. The air was eerily quiet, except for the occasional distant sound of barking dogs. Her heart raced as she considered the risk she was about to take. She had promised herself she wouldn't go to him tonight, that she would stay home with her family. But the pull of Youssef was too strong. She slipped out of the house, her breath shaky as she hurried through the narrow streets toward the edge of the village. Every step felt like a betrayal, her mind filled with the fear of being seen. The tension was suffocating, but Leah couldn't stop herself. As she reached the familiar spot near the olive grove where they usually met, a cold sense of dread washed over her. Youssef was already there, waiting in the shadows. But something was different tonight. His posture was tense, his eyes scanning the surroundings nervously. Leah's pulse quickened as she sensed the same foreboding he did. "What's wrong?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Youssef didn't answer at first, his eyes flickering toward the darkened horizon. "We can't keep doing this," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "It's too dangerous. People are starting to talk." Leah's heart sank. She had known this moment would come, but she had hoped it wouldn't be so soon. The affair, once thrilling, now felt like a ticking time bomb, and the fear of what would happen if they were caught weighed heavy on her chest. Still, she couldn't walk away. Not yet. "I can't stop," Leah confessed, her voice trembling with emotion. "I need you, Youssef. You're the only thing that makes me feel alive." Youssef's jaw tightened, torn between his feelings for Leah and the reality of the situation. They both knew the stakes were higher than ever, and one wrong move could lead to disaster. What neither of them knew was that disaster was already on its way. This was just the beginning. The darkness had only started to creep into their lives, and soon it would consume everything. Leah and Youssef stood in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. The olive trees around them swayed gently in the night breeze, their rustling leaves the only sound in the heavy darkness. Youssef's face was tense, a mixture of fear and regret flickering in his eyes. Leah could feel the distance growing between them, even though they were only inches apart. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this secret," Youssef said, his voice barely above a whisper. "People are suspicious. My brother saw me leaving the village late last week, and he's been asking questions." Leah's heart raced. She knew the risk they were taking, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. Her stomach churned at the thought of someone discovering their affair. In their village, such a betrayal wasn't just a matter of personal shame, it was a crime against their communities, against the delicate balance that kept the two sides from tearing each other apart. "We'll be careful," Leah replied, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "We've been careful all this time. No one will know." Youssef shook his head, his eyes filled with sorrow. "It's not that simple, Leah. My family, they're starting to suspect something. I overheard them talking the other night. They know something is off. If they find out it's you—" He trailed off, but Leah didn't need him to finish. She knew what would happen if anyone found out. The consequences were unthinkable. Leah's breath caught in her throat, the fear of losing Youssef tightening around her like a vice. "You can't leave me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't go back to my life without you." But Youssef's expression hardened, the reality of their situation settling over him like a dark cloud. "If we don't stop this, something terrible will happen. I can feel it. We're playing with fire, Leah. Sooner or later someone is going to get burned." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time Leah felt a true sense of dread. She had always known the danger, but until now it had seemed distant, like something that could be avoided if they were just careful enough. But standing here in the darkness, with Youssef's fearful eyes staring back at her, the reality was impossible to ignore. Youssef turned away from her, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking, "but if we keep going like this, I'm afraid I'll lose everything. My family, my life." Leah reached for him, desperate to hold on to the connection they had, the one thing in her life that felt real. But Youssef pulled away, the distance between them growing with every second. "I love you," Leah whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. She had never said it out loud before, and hearing them now felt both like a release and a death sentence. Youssef's eyes softened for a moment, but the tension returned just as quickly. "I love you too," he said quietly. "But love isn't enough to save us from this." Leah's heart shattered as she watched him walk away, disappearing into the shadows of the olive trees. She stood there for a long time, the weight of her decisions crashing down on her. This affair, this secret she had held so close, was unraveling faster than she could control. And deep down, Leah knew Youssef was right. This was no longer a matter of if they would get caught, but when. And when it happened, the consequences would be far worse than she could ever imagine. The days after Youssef's departure felt like an eternity for Leah. The air in the village was thick with unspoken suspicions, and every glance from her neighbors felt like an accusation. Leah's mind raced constantly, replaying her last conversation with Youssef. His words haunted her. Something terrible will happen. She knew he was right, but she couldn't let go of the only connection that had given her life meaning in months. Her husband David remained oblivious to her turmoil. He was preoccupied with his work at the market, spending long hours away from home. Their interactions were brief and cold, reduced to logistical conversations about their son or household needs. Leah could feel the distance between them growing each day, and it only made her feel more alone. She had tried to act normal, to pretend nothing was wrong, but inside, the tension was eating her alive. Meanwhile, Youssef had been avoiding her. Days turned into weeks, and Leah hadn't heard a word from him. He had disappeared from their usual meeting spots, no longer coming near the village well or the olive grove where they once met. The absence was unbearable, a constant reminder of how fragile their relationship was. Leah longed to see him, to know if he was safe, but she also feared the possibility that he had truly decided to end their affair. One evening, Leah couldn't take it anymore. She decided to visit Youssef's home, despite the risks. The fear of being seen by his family or her own didn't stop her. Desperation had taken hold. She needed to know what was happening, whether Youssef was all right. If they were to end things, she needed to hear it from him directly. As she approached his house, her heart pounded in her chest. The sun had already set, and the streets were quiet. The olive trees cast long shadows on the path, the night sky above her thick with clouds. Leah's steps were cautious, her mind racing with the fear of what could happen if someone saw her. The closer she got, the more she realized how reckless her actions were, but it was too late to turn back. She stood outside Youssef's home, her hands trembling as she raised them to knock. Before she could, the door swung open. Youssef stood in the doorway, his face a mixture of shock and anger. "Leah, what are you doing here?" he hissed, stepping outside quickly and closing the door behind him. "I had to see you," Leah whispered, her voice frantic. "You've been avoiding me. I thought something had happened." Youssef glanced nervously around the darkened street, pulling her into the shadows by the side of the house. His voice was low, tense. "You can't be here. It's too dangerous. My brother has been asking questions about us, Leah. He's suspicious. If anyone finds out—" Before he could finish, a noise interrupted them. The sound of a door creaking open from inside the house. Youssef's eyes widened with fear, and Leah's heart stopped. A shadowy figure stepped out into the courtyard. It was Youssef's brother, Karim. "Youssef, is someone there?" Karim's voice was sharp, filled with suspicion. Panic surged through Leah. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Youssef grabbed her arm, pulling her further into the shadows, trying to shield her from his brother's view. But it was too late. Karim had seen the movement. "Who's there?" Karim demanded, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the figures in the dark. Leah's mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. They had been caught. The very thing they had feared was happening right before their eyes. Karim's expression darkened as realization dawned on him. "Leah?" His voice was filled with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What are you doing here?" Youssef stepped forward, trying to shield Leah from his brother's wrath. "Karim, please, it's not what you think. Let me explain." But Karim wasn't listening. His face twisted with rage, his fists clenched at his sides. "You've been sneaking around with her," he spat, his voice rising. "A Jewish woman? You've betrayed your family, your people for her?" The tension in the air was suffocating, the weight of Karim's words crushing Leah's chest. She had never imagined it would come to this. Youssef tried to reason with his brother, but Karim's anger only grew. Leah could see it in his eyes, the hatred, the disgust. "You've dishonored us, Youssef," Karim snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "This ends now." Before Leah could react, Karim lunged toward Youssef, fists flying. The impact was sudden, brutal. Youssef staggered back, clutching his face as blood spilled from his nose. Leah screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos of the moment. Karim's rage was uncontrollable, and Leah could only watch in horror as the two brothers fought. The consequences of their secret affair had finally caught up with them, and there was no escaping the violence that was now unfolding before her eyes. Leah's heart pounded as she stood frozen, watching Youssef and Karim grapple with each other. The sound of their struggle echoed in the narrow courtyard, a brutal reminder of the consequences of their forbidden affair. Blood dripped from Youssef's nose, his face contorted in pain, while Karim's fury only seemed to intensify with each passing second. "Stop!" Leah cried, her voice breaking, but her plea fell on deaf ears. Karim was consumed by rage, his blows landing with a savage force that left Youssef gasping for breath. Suddenly, a door slammed open from inside the house, and the rest of Youssef's family rushed out, drawn by the noise. His mother, his father, and younger siblings stared in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. Leah's presence there, in their courtyard, was enough to confirm everything. The air thickened with the weight of scandal, shame, and betrayal. "What's going on?" Youssef's father demanded, his voice shaking with anger as he took in the scene, his son fighting with Karim, Leah standing in the shadows, her face pale with fear. Karim, panting and still furious, turned to his father. "It's her!" he spat, pointing at Leah. "He's been seeing her, sneaking around with her behind our backs. He's betrayed us all." Leah's stomach twisted, the full gravity of the situation crashing down on her. There was no turning back now. Everything was out in the open. The secret she and Youssef had fought to keep hidden was now exposed for everyone to see. Youssef's father, a man known for his strict adherence to tradition, stepped forward, his eyes burning with fury. "Is this true, Youssef?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Youssef, blood still trickling from his mouth, didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Leah, his eyes filled with regret and sorrow. He knew what was coming. There was no escaping the consequences now. "Yes," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "It's true." The silence that followed was deafening. Youssef's father looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "You've dishonored this family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've betrayed everything we stand for. A Jewish woman. How could you?" Leah's heart sank as she saw the pain in Youssef's eyes. She wanted to speak, to defend him, to say that it hadn't started out this way, that their love wasn't just some reckless affair, but she knew it wouldn't matter. In this village, in this culture, their relationship was more than a personal betrayal. It was an affront to everything their families believed in. Tears welled in Leah's eyes as she realized how far they had fallen, how deeply they had hurt the people around them. But before she could say anything, Youssef's mother stepped forward, her face pale with shock. "You've ruined us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've destroyed this family." Youssef's father's expression darkened, his hands clenched into fists. "Get out!" he growled, his voice cold and final. "You're no longer my son." Youssef flinched at his father's words, but there was no time to process the pain. Karim, still seething, lunged at Youssef again, and this time his rage took a darker turn. In the chaos of the moment, Karim grabbed a nearby metal rod, raising it above his head. Leah screamed as the realization of what was about to happen hit her, but it was too late. The metal rod came crashing down on Youssef's head with a sickening thud. Time seemed to slow as Leah watched in horror, her scream echoing through the night. Youssef crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. His body lay still, motionless. The courtyard fell into an eerie silence. The only sound was the ragged breathing of Karim, his chest heaving as he stared down at his brother's lifeless body. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, and for a moment Karim looked as though he couldn't believe it himself. Leah collapsed to the ground beside Youssef, her hands trembling as she tried to shake him awake, her tears falling freely onto his bloodied face. But Youssef was gone. The love she had clung to, the man who had been her only solace, was dead. Youssef's father stood motionless, his face pale as he processed the horror unfolding before him. His family was destroyed, his sons shattered by the weight of a forbidden love that had spiraled out of control. His voice, once strong and commanding, was now broken. "Call the police," he muttered, his tone empty. "It's over." Leah barely heard him. She knelt beside Youssef, her body shaking with sobs, the full weight of the tragedy crashing down on her. She had lost everything, her lover, her family, and any hope for a future where their love could have survived. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting harsh shadows across the courtyard. Leah was pulled away from Youssef's body, her cries fading into the background as the authorities took control of the scene. Karim was led away in handcuffs, his face blank as he was arrested for the murder of his own brother. Leah, too, was taken into custody. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, it had all led to this moment, a tragedy that would be remembered in the village for years to come. She knew her life would never be the same. In the weeks that followed, the village was consumed by the scandal. Leah's family disowned her, and David, her husband, filed for divorce. The news of the affair and the murder spread quickly, leaving no room for forgiveness or understanding. Leah was sentenced to prison for her involvement, and Karim, convicted of murder, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As Leah sat in her cell, she replayed the events over and over in her mind, wondering how things had gone so wrong. The love she had once cherished had turned into a nightmare, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. Youssef was gone, and with him any chance of redemption. The story of Leah and Youssef became a dark legend in the village, a cautionary tale of forbidden love and the deadly consequences that followed. In the end, no one won, and the cost of their choices was paid in blood.